students do end up following that same path that you just mentioned, where on average students in college are switching majors 3 times. And then when they graduate, 7 out of 10 students wind up underemployed or working in a career field that they didn't study or really hating their jobs.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or investment advice. Please consult a professional advisor before making decisions based on what you hear on this show. Welcome to that Wall Street Tribe. Excited to bring into the studio Mr. Riley Simpson. Riley, glad to have you, man.
Glad to be here, guys.
Riley, not too many years ago, somebody was asking you, what do you want to be when you grow up? They were saying as you were a high school senior, what are you going to do next year? You probably had a lot of things running through your brain, but for the person listening right now who has a high school senior, maybe a junior, maybe a college freshman, and they're trying to decide, what should my kids be doing? What's the right next step? How are you trying to figure out that question, and how did you process it, and what did you do?
Man, this is something I think about all the time. And it is that question of what are you going to do next? That was the question that I was getting asked. And I had no idea at all. And really had no idea about how to go about figuring it out. And so I got lucky. My parents suggested, hey, why don't you go try some stuff before you go into college and go into debt, just, without any plan. And so that's what I ended up doing. And we'll get to that story in a second here. But what I've really learned is that we put a ton of pressure on students as they're graduating high school to ask that question of what are you going to do next? And if you look at the statistics, there's like 4 million students graduating high school a year in America. And 80% of them have no idea the answer to that question or how to answer it. And so for me, I think it's really about asking a different set of questions before we get to that question of what are you going to do? And for me, those questions are, who are you? What do you love? What are you great at? And what does the world need? If you can answer those 4, it'll line up for the next one.
If you've listened to our show for any length of time, you've heard us talk about infinite banking and how we were able to use that concept to create over $50,000 a month in passive income. But it's just not that easy to figure out, how does this all connect into my own personal system?
Stallion, that's why we created the passive income operating system, bro. It shows you how to turn active income into passive income. It makes all the steps come together. If you would like to get access to it as a podcast listener, we've never given this away in public before. Go to what'swhatwallstreet.com/PIOS.
So you did what? You left high school, and what did you do instead of going to college?
Yeah, so I ended up just jumping out, no plan, and scrabbled together as we went. And the first thing I did was I actually got this saving grace of something called the Johnson O'Connor Center, which is an aptitude center that's been around for around 100 years. And they bring you in for 2 days. They do these tests with you in person, and then they generate a list of careers that actually are a match to your profile of aptitudes. And you can think about these as like strengths and weaknesses, less about personality. And that list that they gave me had all kinds of things on it. Everything from private investigator to real estate to doing something within the mediation space. And then even at the top, it was like, be a CEO. And so I looked at that list and I said, I have no idea how to test being a CEO, but this thing, mediation, that caught my eye. And so basically what happened is over those next 2 years after high school, I just went and I found a way to try on the different careers on that list that were interesting to me and see if they were actually a fit in the way that matched not only with my strengths, but also with where my curiosities and interests lie.
How many of those jobs did you, quote unquote, try on?
In total, it was at least 7. So we started off with mediation, got credentialed as a mediator in Texas, and was actually really gifted at that. It was funny. I walked into that classroom and everybody in there was an attorney that was 30 years older than me. I had just turned 19 as I graduated high school, and I still had braces. And so everybody's looking around being like, what are you doing here, man? But after this course ended, the people teaching it kind of came to me and said, hey, you're really gifted. Come help us coach it. And so for me, I went from being this kid who had no idea what I was going to do, was pretty insecure, and just didn't even have a plan, to like getting this flip switched at the beginning of that was saying, hey, if you're good at something, people are actually going to notice it and will bring you into opportunities. So it went from mediation, moved to Colorado, got my real estate license there. While I was doing that, was shadowing an agent and realized that there was a need for more videos of the houses. And so I bought a drone and I made some videos and pitched it to the whole real estate office and said, hey, I'll make a video of your houses for $200. And that was my first business. So I started a business. And then as I was making those videos, I thought, hey, you know what? I like this. I like storytelling. Maybe I want to make movies. So I moved back to Austin, got into the film industry, ended up becoming a second assistant director. Did that for a little while, Snapchat, HP computers, some short films, some feature lengths. And then finally, I rounded out those 2 years doing a youth ministry internship. Because at the time, I was still battling with my faith and saying, hey, am I going to be a full-time ministry, or am I going to go into business, and just trying to figure out what that looked like.
So you ended up actually trying on the CEO role after all, like the whole drone video company, right? I mean, that's amazing.
That's true. It was an accidental try on.
Riley, I asked you to go through that process because I think so many of us can relate to when we were going through college and we were trying on different things, but just doing it in the form of taking different courses, right? We were actually inside the businesses. Most people don't know this about me, Riley, but my first ambition out of high school, I was going to be a landscape architect.
Wow.
Now, based upon this flowered shirt, you go, you like being outdoors. And based upon these hands, you go, you absolutely don't, right? Like, so very easily did I transition. And I transitioned multiple times, 4 times to be exact, right? So by my second junior year, I really had figured out what I wanted to do in life. And I had to be able to then expedite to get out of college, right? I was Tommy boy in that situation. I didn't have a doctorate, but I felt like I'd been there as long as some of them. And I think there's so many parents right now that are listening to this that are relating. They're saying, man, is my kid going through that, or will my kid go through that? And you said that people are asked the question, what do you want to do? So I want to go back to the 4 things that you ask, the 4 questions you ask each one of these children and high school seniors, and why are they so important to know those answers instead of what do you want to do?
The reality is a lot of the frameworks that people use for deciding what they're going to do have to do with pressure from parents about, hey, you got to pick a good career that's going to take care of you. They have to do with like social pressure of like, I got to do a career that is going to look good and give me some prestige. That's a big thing in the adolescent mind, is like, how do I get social prestige? They come from a kind of a place of just like, hey, I need to find my passion. And so there's this like really big pressure to say like, what is my passion and how do I figure it out? And the thing is, there's this something called, I would call a dysfunctional belief, that you have to have the exact right answer on that question at 18 years old, at 17 years old. And the reality is that is impossible. You can't know the right answer. And the second reality is the answer is probably going to keep changing. And so what happens is we actually end up with careers that are most of the time nonlinear. The average millennial is doing 15 different career transitions, not job transitions, career transitions. And so what we really get to do is kind of like break it down and say, hey, if our framework of the world relies on us having the exact right answer to what we got to do, we're just like a non-starter from the beginning. So what are the questions that we could focus on answering that would actually begin to build for us some kind of, if you would, a flywheel that builds self-awareness and maturity and skill, so that as we grow and we come to these like career inflection points, we have the toolkit necessary to make a good decision about what the next right step is, rather than about trying to get the exact right answer for all time. Are you with me on that? Does that make sense?
No, I also equate it to what's the cost of not figuring that out, right? Like I was not joking. I was dead serious on how many times I was changing majors, and it did take me a little over a year extra than the 4 years to get through college. But that is I mean, the average person is not getting through college in 4 years. It's taking 5 and 5.5 and 6 years. But the difference is when I went to college, it was a fraction of the cost that it is right now. So one, you got the cost of time, you have the cost of the tuition and room and board, the lost earning opportunity, but also have you noticed like maybe what the psyche of the student going through and thinking that they're going to do something and then not knowing and changing, and then even when they graduate, they go get their graduate degree and then they go get a PhD and then they want to get the whatever's after that. I mean, it's just continuous because they still don't know what they want to do. And I think do you see this kind of psyche struggle, this mindset struggle that people are dealing with when they don't really know what they want to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the generation I'm actually a part of, this is going to make me sound really young, but I'm the oldest year of Generation Z. So Generation Z goes from 13-year-olds right now to 27-year-olds, which is where I fall into. And Generation Z has sometimes been called the anxious generation. And that's because there's higher levels of depression and anxiety in this generation than in any generation we've seen in history before. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But what's happening is when this generation is getting into college and there's like so much pressure to answer that question, students do end up following that same path that you just mentioned, where on average students in college are switching majors 3 times. And then when they graduate, 7 out of 10 students wind up underemployed or working in a career field that they didn't study or really hating their jobs. And so there's this kind of tragedy that happens where that depression, that anxiety just increases as they grow through life instead of decreasing as they mature. One of the stories I would just tell you really quickly to illustrate this, I had a good friend my freshman year of college. And remember, I came in freshman year of college after those 2 years. I was like full of confidence, clarity, where I was going. I had just been completely transformed by those gap years. This student that I met, she became a good friend. She was brilliant. She had gone to a private Christian school in Austin, Texas. She was like top of her class. She got in freshman year and she was so paralyzed by this idea of what am I going to study? Because she had to have the right answer, that she put all of the majors into a hat, shuffled them around, and pulled one out. And that major ended up being civil engineering. And so she like threw her entire 4 years up to a hat draw. And so she studied for 4 years to get the civil engineering degree. She was a great student, so she was top of her class. But she graduated, got into a great firm, and ended up hating the work. And so she quit, and now she works in like almost a social work capacity now. To me, that's a tragedy that like is actually just going to compound this idea of the anxious generation as people graduate into the workforce and find that they haven't found a sense of purpose or meaning or work that aligns with who they are.
So Riley, this is great points that you're bringing up. And I think the parents that are listening to you right now are either in one of two camps. And one of those, they're pretty confident about the path for their kid, and they're going to probably just follow the traditional college path. And they have something that's giving them enough clarity to say that this is going to be fine. This is going to work out. But there's a handful of our kids that we're just not convinced like this is going to be the best route for them. Maybe it's their personality, maybe it's their experiences have led us to believe that for whatever reason. But the idea of the gap year, how you had it, you had great results, right?
Yeah.
2 years in, you're like, man, I have clarity. I can now move forward with confidence. But it also didn't have a lot of structure. It sounds like you got this list and you started just proactively trying to go through it. What about for the parents that say, maybe I could facilitate a gap year for their kids? What would you encourage them to put into that? Like, or how would they even practically do that?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind here. One, when I look back on my own experience, it had a lot less structure and I wish it had more, because even though I gave you all the highlights, there were months within those 2 years where I was just floundering, trying to figure out what am I going to do next? When I think about, how somebody could design a really healthy gap year for their student or work with their student to design that really, there's a couple of things that would just come in as best principles. The first of those I would call guided independence. So that's where we're wanting to think about how do we give them some structure, but also leave room for them to make mistakes and fail and have the independence to, like, they have to be the ones driving this thing. So I would say if a student doesn't want to do this, it's not going to be a good fit. They have to be sold on the vision, right? So that's just a principle that comes into mind on the design piece. A few of the components that I think make it really successful is how can that student start really early in building what I would call a personal advisory board. And so this is like beyond just the parents, who are the people that this student can look to and start collecting a set of mentors that can help them think through these aspects of their life. And so as they kind of go through this year, I think the big thing to prioritize is what I call prototyping things. So instead of just like saying, hey, you should go work for the year at Chick-fil-A, or you should go travel for the year, maybe see different cultures. Those are good things. But how do you actually like come up with some hypotheses about, hey, who is this student uniquely created to be? And what are the things that are their unique giftings? And what are the things that could send them down? Now, there's still several paths they could take, but hopefully that's beginning to narrow it a little bit. And then within that narrowed kind of aperture, how do we pick a few things for this student to go try? And as they're trying them, do they have mentors that they can be working with to reflect on that with? And so I have some mentorship frameworks for how I coach students on that. But the most important thing is that you just have people in your corner that you look up to them and you say, hey, they've got a good life, and I would like enjoy having a life like them. So I feel comfortable with them speaking into my life as I go through this journey. Those are just two things that I think would be really helpful as you begin to set that path up.
There was nothing worse than walking into class when you're in school and the teacher saying, pop quiz day. Why? Because you were unprepared. Are you unprepared, though, for financial freedom?
Don't be. Find out how close you are by taking our 30-second quiz at wealthwithoutwallstreet.com/quiz. Hey, Wealth Without Wall Street family. If you're serious about building passive income through real estate, then you need to check out Dustin Heiner's podcast, Master Passive Income.
Yeah, Dustin retired himself at 37 years old using rental properties. And now he's teaching you how to do the very same thing step by step. If you're looking for real estate strategies that actually work, this is the podcast for you.
So go subscribe to Master Passive Income wherever you listen to podcasts and start building your path to financial freedom today. Go check it out now. The alternative that you mentioned before of someone just going in blindly, putting everything in a hat and shaking it up compared to what you just gave. I mean, it's just like, this is so bonkers that, some of us are literally leaving all this time up to the shake of a hat.
Yeah.
We could be so much more on purpose. So I love the fact that your story involves both a gap year or 2 gap years and then college.
Yeah.
And the transformation that occurred, because what I'm hearing you say is, man, the journey is a lot less about one way or the other. It's about clarity. And I would just love to hear maybe some examples outside of yourself that you've seen other people get to that point of clarity for their students, or for that student themselves to get to a point of clarity.
I think the bigger point of this has to do with the students' mindsets and frameworks that they're working with. And so the biggest thing I actually am going to point to here in this question is what institutions are starting to see. So when we actually look at Harvards of the world, the Princeton of the world, the Yale, and another 100 of the top universities, we're actually seeing a trend where these universities are beginning to encourage gap years. So Harvard actually has an entire page on their website dedicated to encouraging a gap year. And every student that gets accepted into their program, into their school, is actually asked, hey, would you please defer for 1 year and go do something meaningful? Because what we're finding is that every student who goes away for a year, if they are intentional with that year, they come back and they're better students, and they end up having more meaningful and fulfilled lives on the other side. And so we're actually seeing that there's a broader trend happening in America where we're actually catching up to something that's been the norm in Europe for years. So almost everyone in Europe does a gap year. It's a very common thing for people, or a 13th year is sometimes what it's called. And in the US, we're starting to see that kind of trend catch up. So institutionally, we see colleges saying, hey, you guys should go do this. We see better outcomes in grades. We see better outcomes in like line up with like what you studied and is it meaningful for you after you graduate. And then we're actually beginning to see that this is going from something that used to be kind of, I would just say gap years used to have kind of a reputation for being something that either the really, really rich did or the loser kid did, the kid that has no clue, no prospects in life. What we're seeing is actually in America, over 50% of students graduating are beginning to make this a real serious option. And so that's not a personal story as much as it is like a trend of like in America, where just every single student that does one of these is already signaling to universities, oh, that's actually probably a better student for our purposes. And employers are saying students who did a gap year are more employable. So there's great stats around employers saying students coming right out of college who never did anything like a gap year, they don't have the skill sets needed to actually be valuable on the job immediately, and they require further training. But students who've taken gap years, they like are able to work with agency and take initiative and get things done.
Yeah. What would you tell the parent who's like, oh, if I don't send my kid to college, yes, they may just get derailed and never get back onto a clear path, right? But also, where are they going to meet friends? Where are they going to meet their spouse? Where are they going to, get engaged, given that so oftentimes that's where we as parents, that's where we met, right? My wife and I met at college. Joey and his wife met at college, right? So how do you help parents understand or think through that, as maybe that may be the simplest, but maybe one of the biggest obstacles? And then the second question I have for you, just thinking through like questions that I think are on the minds of both the kids and the parents. The kids, I think, are the most, as you said, I didn't know that Gen Z was the kind of the age of anxiety, if you will, because I have so many, almost every one of my kids fall in Gen Z is, hey, what I need to tell people I'm going to go do something. And a gap year doesn't necessarily allude to the something. I know I'm going to not go to college, but what am I going to do? Well, I don't know that yet, so gap year doesn't equate to college. It doesn't equate to going to do an exact job. It's just kind of this vague space. How do you help answer those two questions that I think are on the minds of a lot of the people in this consideration?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the first one's fun. It's, how do we get our kids married to somebody good? So that question for me, actually, I met my spouse, who's amazing, during my gap years. So I closed out those 2 years doing youth ministry as an intern, and my now wife was also an intern. And so I just met her doing something, serving in a way, and being on mission for something that aligned with what I cared about in my life. And so my answer to that question of like, how are they going to meet somebody is, I give this dating advice to young people anyway. Hey, just do the things that are on mission with your life and look around and see who's next to you. And that's usually how you're going to meet people. The belief that you have to go to college to find a spouse really ends up poorly for those students who do go to college and don't find a spouse. And then on the other end of it, they're like, well, did I fail? And the reality is, like, I went to Abilene Christian University. That school is like getting to like, I think 60% all female. So the reality is there's a lot of those women that are not going to find somebody to marry, right? On the other hand, I think that nationally, our stats are actually trending towards about 70% of students attending college are female. So the stats just don't line up. There's not enough people. So you're going to have to find different ways to meet people no matter what. Doing a gap year is going to be something that helps you align more with self-awareness, which is always going to be a good way to help attract somebody who's going to be awesome. So that's my kind of first answer. You want me to move on to the next one? Or do you want
no, that's perfect. Yeah. So let's answer the question about, okay, how do I help my student not have anxiety of when people ask them, what are you going to do this year? What are you going to do next year? What are you going to do after you graduate? And they know it's a gap year, but they have anxiety because they don't know exactly what fills in that gap.
Yeah. Well, on the one hand, this is a place where I'll just shamelessly plug what I'm building. So I'm building LeapYear, which is a structured gap year designed to help students, become more competent and confident through the year. We can maybe talk about that in a second. And so one is just like, hey, is there something out there that you could find that has a plan that you could just plug yourself into and feel really good about, hey, this is prestigious. This has this is a really clear outcomes for me, and just join that. The other thing is, if you're not going to join someone else's plan, make your own plan. And that's what I did. And so whenever I was graduating high school, I had to actually present to a board of local community members. Everyone in my high school did this about what I was going to do after high school. And so I made a presentation about, hey, I'm going to go do a gap year, and I don't know what it's all going to look like yet, but here are a few things that I am building into this year to make sure that I'm doing it with intention. And so I just think if you can be intentional, be confident in that intention, and just know that all your peers who say, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to go major in engineering, and I'm going to go major in civil engineering, or whatever it is, they actually don't have a clue what they're doing either. And so just be confident in who you are. And in a few years, you'll look up and most likely you'll be ahead of all the peers you graduated with.
I love that advice, Riley, because it is so true that just because it's the common answer doesn't mean that there's any more clarity, right? I mean, I've heard many, many people over the years say, I went into X, Y, or Z occupation or into this major because my dad had a friend who was a dentist. And I thought, you know what? He got to play golf on Fridays. And so maybe I want to be a dentist. I mean, literally no depth of knowledge. And yet people say, that's my direction, my plan. And they get into it and they're like, this is the worst idea of all time. So,
yes.
Man, this is super helpful, I think, for the parents listening to say, man, how do I lead my kids? How do I give them alternatives that they may not have even considered? But I love the last point, being intentional, right?
Mm-hmm.
Purposeful with that time. Because a gap year for just, a gap year, it without an actual purpose is going to be a big waste of time. And I love that you said that some of these colleges are, and even employers are recognizing the importance of a gap year, that it was intentional. Because in my mind, there's almost an element of, well, they just do a gap year because they didn't know what to do. And it's kind of like, this guy doesn't have any direction, but man, you've given me so much more to think about as it relates to that. And I would like to break down, if we could, what is the LeapYear program? Like, what sort of things will you be doing with that program with people?
Russ, did you want to jump in? I just saw you.
No, I'm sitting here eager to hear the answer because I've got kids coming. I'm going to have them sit down and listen to this interview for sure.
Wonderful. Perfect. Yeah. So LeapYear is really a combination of building what I wish I had back then, and then last 2 years getting to work at Learn Capital, a venture fund that invests in education, really seeing what's missing in the education market, specifically higher ed. That's all come to inform how I'm building LeapYear. And so here's what the program is. We start with that premise that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. Instead of asking the question, what are you going to do next? We ask the questions, who are you? What do you love? What are you great at? And what does the world need? And the way that we help students ask those questions and then begin to unpack them is that we do it in a cohort format. The cohorts are 20 students to one cohort. And over the course of 12 months, we do 4 main things. We do career prototyping, which involves internships, job shadows, maybe starting a business in something or doing a really intentional project. So that's career prototyping. We do intensive learning around things that you're not going to get in college. And so these things fall into 4 categories. They're identity and calling. Who are you? And what were you made to do? They are professional development. So, hey, how do you interview for a job well? Once you get the job, how do you crush it? They are essential skill sets. So no matter what career you go into, you need to be a great communicator and leader. And then finally, it's the what does the world need piece. And that is, how do you get exposed to global and local problems and effective solutioning techniques so you don't make those problems worse? Okay, so that's career prototyping, and that's intensive learning. And then the third component, we have a dedicated coach for each of these students. And so they're going to be building a personal advisory board of mentors, but they've also got this coach that's working with them one-on-one every single week to process through what they're doing. And then finally, we're actually incorporating spiritual formation into the whole program. And so for us, the 2 main things that we're answering with that spiritual formation is, hey, does God actually care about your work? And how does your story fit into God's bigger story? And there's a lot to unpack within what we're doing there, but it's a really ecumenical approach to spiritual formation that ends with students coming out with a rule of life and a way of like cementing some spiritual habits that are going to carry their faith beyond this year through college and after that. So those are the components of the year. And there's a lot more to break down, but that's kind of an overview.
Man, this has been so good. Tribe, if you are interested in this for your student or want to share this with a friend or a family member who has a student upcoming that maybe needs to hear this, maybe needs to put to ease some of the anxiety that they have and know that there's alternatives, to know that gap years aren't wasting time, isn't necessarily lack of structure or never going back to college or lack of academic momentum, right? It's more focused on how do I add value to the world? And in that, gaining so much, maybe not even spending money, but gaining money, right? Like being paid and then getting on fire to figure out what the thing is that you can add value to the world. Send them to wealthwithoutwallstreet.com/gap year. And on that page, Riley, you're going to give us all the stuff about Leap Year and all the opportunities of how they can connect with you and figure out if this is something that their student would be interested in and qualify for and so forth and so on. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right.
Excited for it.
Riley, thank you so much for coming on and sharing. It's been an amazing time.
Thank you, guys. Wonderful to be on here. I love what you're doing. And we'll have to find some way to teach these gap year students infinite banking.
There you go. Now you're speaking our love language. You heard it here, Tribe. Thank you so much for listening. Take time to rate and review the show. Share it with somebody so they can be on their journey as well as have more clarity for their children as well. Have an amazing day.
This has been the Wealth Without Wall Street podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the show to break free of the Wall Street mindset and begin building wealth on your own terms in places you understand so that your wealth will never run dry. See you next episode.